Good afternoon. Great to see you all, especially this time of year. This afternoon's lecture is co-sponsored by the World Christianity and Global Encounters of the 21st Century Fund, as well as the Adams Mission Fund. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Stephen Prothero, who is a professor in the Department of Religion at Boston University and the author of numerous books and articles and blogs. I want to give you a list of his books along with their subtitles to give you a sense of his writing. Purified by Fire, A History of Cremation in America. The American Bible, Whose America Is This? God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World. Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. American Jesus, How the Son of God Became a National Icon. And his book to be released, I believe, in early January, Why Liberals Win the Culture Wars Even When They Lose Elections. Along with his research and writings, Professor Prothero lives part-time in the religio blogosphere of CNN. He maintains a blog for CNN, and some of the titles of his blog posts include Town Prayers Need Less Jesus, More Krishna. Obama Channels Reagan at Boston Interfaith Service. I like the titles of these books and blogs. Professor Prothero has been interviewed on The Colbert Report, NPR, PBS, CBS, Oprah, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He's been interviewed by numerous newspapers, for instance, the New York Times, Boston Globe, LA Times, and the Wall Street Journal. His Religion 140 is a Twitter mini course on the great religions in 140 characters. Professor Prothero received his BA at Yale in American Studies and his PhD at Harvard in the study of religion. He currently lives in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. He's advocated for public schools to teach both Bible and world religions, and that's something I would personally affirm as well. This afternoon's lecture is titled Why Liberals Win the Culture Wars, which, as I mentioned, is the title of his new book to be released in January. After his remarks, he will lead a brief time of question and answers. Please join me in welcoming Professor Prothero to Westmont College.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles. It's nice to be here. I think what I learned from that introduction is that my book titles need to be shorter. So I will work on that. It's great to be back in Santa Barbara. I was saying that I was here at UC Santa Barbara for a semester many years ago, maybe 12 or 15 or 20 or 9, something like that. A long time, in my life, a long time ago. And I loved being here, but I never made it up the hill to Westmont, so it's really nice to be here. Also, I publish my books now with Harper One, and my publisher there is a graduate of Westmont College, and my editor, until he just left the publishing house, Roger Freet, also a graduate of Westmont. So those books are co-products of me and Westmont College graduates. So another nice reason to be here. So this talk today is more about politics than it's about religion, but it's also about religion. So I hope that will work for all of you. We'll see. And I look forward to your comments. So I should not need to tell you that American politics is a mess. Politicians in both parties are increasingly treating their political opponents as enemies. Democrats call Republicans terrorists. Republicans call Democrats radicals and socialists. And we have been doing this for decades on so-called values questions from abortion to homosexuality, that many see as matters of absolute morality or unchanging biblical truth, and therefore not subject to the typical negotiation and compromise of the political space. But in recent years, this approach has spread from cultural politics to politics in general. As moderates were purged from both major parties or left office disgusted of their own accord, and as institutions that benefited from political polarization became more influential, including Fox and MSNBC, those who were left behind fought life and death battles with their enemies, so-called, over matters such as the debt ceiling that used to be resolved unanimously and without debate. The outrage that had long been reserved for disputes over family values bled into debates over marginal tax rates and presidential appointments. This expansion of the footprint of the culture wars has made our politics even more polarized and our politicians more partisan. See, for example, the distance in personality between genial Ronald Reagan and angry Donald Trump last night. As a result, approval ratings for Congress are at all-time lows, 7% the last poll I saw, less popular, according to recent surveys, than root canals, head lice, and communists. But polarization is not confined just to Capitol Hill. Perhaps Facebook is at fault for seducing us into spending less time with people with whom we disagree politically. Perhaps the redrawing of congressional districts is to blame. But either way, Democrats and Republicans are more deeply divided today than they have been in my lifetime, with roughly a third of rank-and-file party members seeing the opposition party as, quote, a threat to the nation's well-being, end quote. My book started in an effort to make sense of these two sides in this polarized debate between the left and the right. And it really started for me during the Ground Zero Mosque debate, the debate over this Islamic community center that was proposed to be built a few blocks away from Ground Zero. And I remember foolishly being surprised by the debate and how angry it turned and how anti-Islamic the conversation went, not so much among people who were part of groups like Stop Islamicization of America, but more by mainstream political figures, by leaders in the Republican Party. And I decided I wanted to make sense of that historically because it didn't make sense to me. I thought two of the bedrock political principles in American public life are the right to private property and religious liberty. And if this Muslim had bought this land and wanted to put up a building with a mosque in it, why would anyone in the name of any American values try to prevent him? Today I want to tell you what I discovered as I tried to explore this backstory to the Ground Zero Mosque in our contemporary culture wars. But to get started, I want to first define my terms. What is a culture war? What do I mean by this term? Culture wars, as I understand them, have four features. They are, first of all, public disputes recorded in such sources as presidential speeches, the congressional record, and popular magazines and newspapers. Second, these disputes extend beyond economic questions of taxing and spending to moral, cultural, and religious questions that are typically less open to negotiation and compromise. Third, they give rise to larger questions about the meaning of America and who is not a true American. And fourth, they are heated, fueled by a rhetoric of war and driven by the conviction that one's enemies are also enemies of the nation. Church historian George Marsden once defined a fundamentalist as an evangelical who's angry about something. Culture warriors are citizens who are angry about something. Repeatedly, they resort to martial metaphors, accusations of sedition, threats of civil war. To them, these are not merely political disputes. They are battles for the soul of the nation. The term culture wars, therefore, refers, in my reading, to angry, even violent, public disputes that are simultaneously moral, religious, and cultural, and address the meaning of America. The United States is supposed to be a nation of immigrants and a nation of religions. The Statue of Liberty opens her arms to newcomers from every land. The First Amendment guarantees every citizen religious liberty. So where there are Quran burners or mosque arsonists, our reflex is to see them as exceptional, departures from American norms of tolerance, laissez-faire, and goodwill. But is cultural conflict really so un-American? Philosopher Horace Kallen has described the United States as an orchestration of mankind, in which people of many different races and religions contribute to what he calls a symphony of civilization. But the United States has also been a Babel of civilization, in which people of different races and religions turned the nation into something akin to Tennyson's vision of the state of nature, red in tooth and claw. There is a strong tradition in American life of coming to the defense of religious minorities and of conducting our public debates with some measure of civility. But it's hard to find moments in U.S. history when our politics were not tied up in clashes of religious identities and cultural commitments. Because Americans have not inherited an ancient culture, they have had to invent one or more. But Americans have always disagreed about which of these inventions they should value. So culture here has always been hotly contested. In fact, Americans have been engaging in the cultural equivalent of war at least since the early republic, in key compromises meant to smooth things over between the states that formed the United States. The founders left unsettled key questions that would foment discord and even rebellion in decades to come. One, of course, was slavery. Another was the relationship between church and state. My book looks at 5 episodes of this cultural discord, and I want to talk about them briefly here to introduce you to them. The first, the election of 1800, pitted Thomas Jefferson and his Jeffersonians, known then as Democratic Republicans, against Federalists and John Adams. It was John Adams against Thomas Jefferson in that election. And as those of you who have seen Hamilton on Broadway, has anyone seen it yet? You should go if you can get a ticket. It's sold out for the next year or something, but I went to it recently. It's about Alexander Hamilton. This culture war included a battle on the House floor, started with a shot of tobacco spit into the eye that led to a fight with one representative with a hickory cane, the other with fireplace tongs. They used to have fireplace with wood fire heating up the House floor. It happened at a time, the election of 1800, like our own, in which many newspapers were partisan papers. In fact, all of them at the time. A Federalist newspaper called the Jeffersonians the very refuse and filth of society. A Jeffersonian paper called John Adams, blind, bald, crippled, toothless. Meanwhile, Jefferson called the Federalists enemies of our Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton spoke of saving the United States from the fangs of Jefferson. Federalists, the conservatives in this culture war, were popular in New England among merchants. They favored a strong national bank, strong executive branch, strong Senate, state establishments. They favored England over France in our foreign policy, and their key words were security, order, stability. The Jeffersonians were popular in the South among farmers. They opposed the national bank. They favored agriculture over commerce. They argued for low taxes, limited government, popular sovereignty. Their key word was liberty, which could only be secured, in their view, by representative government, by states' rights, and by the separation of church and state. According to Federalists, Jeffersonians were French-loving anarchists, willing and eager to sacrifice social order on the altar of liberty. According to Jefferson, the Federalists were Tories in disguise, an Anglican, monarchical, and aristocratic party, consisting, in his words, of timid men who prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty. But the key issue in the election of 1800 was Jefferson's religion. Was he, as Massachusetts Federalist Theophilus Parsons divined, the great archpriest of Jacobinism and infidelity? Or was he, as the Connecticut Current, a Federalist paper, intimated, a secret Jew or Muslim. President Obama was not the first president to be accused of being a secret Muslim. The election ended in a tie. The Jeffersonians were not clever enough to figure out that you needed to have one of the electors withhold a vote from the vice president. And so both Jefferson and his vice presidential running mate, Aaron Burr, got the same amount of votes. And the rules of the Constitution at the time then sent the election into the House of Representatives, which was controlled by the opposing party, by the Federalists. What happened was a fracas that almost erupted in civil war. 35 ballots before finally Thomas Jefferson was awarded the presidency that he had effectively won in the election. In his first inaugural address, he attempted to calm things down by, among other things, evoking God. And in the process, he contributed to what I have called the great tradition of conciliation in American public life. He said, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," he said. This is like someone now saying we are all Democrats, we are all Republicans, a kind of an unimaginable utopian vision. The second culture war in my book is about anti-Catholicism in the early 19th century, the battle between white Protestants and Roman Catholics, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s. I open this chapter with a story of the burning of an Ursuline convent in Charleston outside of Boston in 1834. And I move on to Bible riots in Philadelphia in the 1840s, which were instigated over which Bible would be used in the public schools. During this culture war, Catholics were accused of three things: of being moral villains, of being theological imposters, which is to say fake Christians, and most importantly in the debate, of being traitors to the nation, pinning their politics to a foreign dictator, a pope, rather than following their own sovereign conscience as American voters were supposed to do. This culture war shows that culture wars can be violent and can be deadly. Dozens of people died in the Philadelphia Bible riots of the 1840s. The third culture war I look at is anti-Mormonism. And I learned a lot in doing the research on this, so much so that I now view the anti-Mormonism crusade of the pre- and post-Civil War period, mostly post-Civil War, as the greatest affront to religious liberty in American history. During this anti-Mormon crusade, local, state, and federal government were all enlisted to fight the Mormons, as were all three branches of the federal government. The first ruling of the Supreme Court on church-state religious liberty was issued against the Mormons. 5 straight presidents gave speeches that were opposed to the Mormons. One governor vowed to exterminate all Mormons living in his state. The founder of the Mormon tradition, Joseph Smith, was assassinated by a mob. Many church members and church leaders were tarred and feathered in the process. And there's an amazing trail of documentation of the arguments between Mormons and anti-Mormons about the Mormon tradition, the Mormon Book of Mormon, about polygamy, about theocracy in the Utah Territory. Mormons responded to this assault by calling their critics un-American, for warring on religious liberty and trampling the Constitution. They also defended polygamy, which became the central issue of the debate, as a sociological and biblical good. They looked to the Old Testament for evidence of God's blessing on polygamy. Critics said that the Constitution did not provide cover for heathenism and immorality. The Latter-day Saints Church was an enemy of the state. It was treason against the government of God and a total subversion of American political ideals. This debate ended shortly after the so-called Manifesto of 1890, when the leaders of the Latter-day Saints Church agreed to give up on polygamy, and that opened the way to Utah statehood later in that decade. The Fourth Culture War is about Prohibition, battle between the wets and the dries, as they were called, the drinkers and the teetotalers. This led to the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment, which overturned the 18th Amendment. In other words, an era of about 13 years in the 20s and early 30s, where the United States experimented with the prohibition of alcohol. This was the first time the Constitution had been used to restrict the liberties of Americans rather than to extend them. Billy Sunday, the famous evangelical revivalist, former center fielder for the Chicago White Sox, who used to, at the start of his revivals, run across the stage and slide toward the podium and do a pop-up slide and start his talk. He called Prohibition the mother of all sins. He was a former alcoholic himself. Carrie Nation provided, I guess what we would now call them would be something like performance art, political protest. She would go into saloons with a hatchet and start hatcheting up the counter of the saloon and the bottles as a protest against the saloon. But Prohibition was not just about booze. It was about a wider culture war that concerned jazz, organized crime, the automobile, sex, racial mixing, and the speakeasies that emerged in the 1920s. The core tension, as I read it, was between a more monocultural and a more multicultural understanding of the United States. Is the United States a blend of different peoples, or is it a country of white Protestants? Today's culture wars, what I call the contemporary culture wars, to distinguish them from these prior episodes, started in the late 1970s and are still going today. Although about every year there's a prediction from someone, thank God, or the culture wars are over. They seem to keep going on and on and on. They began, as I understand them, with debate over segregation academies in the late 1970s when the IRS changed the tax law, or its interpretation of the tax law, so that segregated white private schools that had emerged in the wake of the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1965, when the IRS ruled that those schools could not be tax deductible. They took away the tax exemption of these schools that they deemed to be segregationist schools. But over time, the culture warriors of the 1970s and 1980s pivoted from this explicitly racist position to two different questions that traveled better outside of the South, where these culture wars began. And the first was the gender and family questions that we now associate with the culture wars: abortion, homosexuality, the patriarchal family, the breadwinner male. And the second was a pivot from race to religion, where the IRS was accused of discriminating against religion, and where right evangelicals cast themselves not as bigots, but as victims of bigotry. Like earlier culture wars, this was a response to anxiety about a way of life that was passing away. A culture that was controlled by whites, organized around the traditional family, centered on the myth of a Christian America. And in this culture war, we see two different understandings of the nation, this monocultural and multicultural nation as well. Is there one sort of American family or many American families? Is the United States a Christian nation or a nation of Christians and Jews, Hindus and Muslims and non-believers, as President Obama said in his first inaugural address? Is this a place for one race, or is it a composite nation, as it was described by Frederick Douglass? The key arguments I make in the book as I move through these 5 culture wars are the following. And I'll do these and then we'll open it up for more questions after that. First of all, the culture wars cannot be reduced to moral contests between absolutists and moral relativists. If you've come across James Davison Hunter's book on the culture wars, which really helped in the early 90s to bring this issue to public prominence, He's an ethicist sociologist, I guess, at the University of Virginia. He argued that U.S. politics had become a contest not between competing political parties or economic theories, but between compelling moral visions. That's what the culture wars were about. A battle between unchanging, transcendent authority in scripture or natural law on the conservative side, and on the liberal side between malleable, earthbound authority in the South. I think this works as a description of the contemporary culture wars, but it doesn't work for the earlier culture wars. Because both sides in the earlier culture wars were moral absolutists. Even in the 1920s, moral relativism was still waiting to be born in terms of American public culture. The culture wars cannot be reduced to religious wars either. Wars between Jefferson and Jesus, as I originally titled my book. I was thinking about this as an ongoing battle throughout American history between believers and unbelievers. That doesn't work either, even though this view is common on both the religious right and the secular left in their own battle today over how religious the American public square should be. Susan Jacoby, who's a free thinker who has written a series of books about atheism in America, she says at the heart of the culture wars lies this question: is America founded for man and for man alone, or is it a society singularly blessed by and answerable to God? She votes for the former. The contemporary culture wars also fit this bill to some extent, at least through the 2004 election when President George W. Bush proclaimed his born-again faith with the easy grace of a child preacher, while his Democratic challenger, Senator John Kerry, seemed uneasy, I would say typically New England, whenever he was asked about his Catholicism. But our culture wars are rarely battles between belief and unbelief. Typically, they are intra-religious affairs, pitting one group of religious folks against another group of religious folks. Protestants against Catholics, for example, in the Bible wars of the 1840s and the Prohibition struggles of the 1920s and 1930s. Another popular interpretation of the culture wars I reject in the book is that the culture wars are simply economic wars in drag. This we associate with Thomas Frank's book from 2004 called What's the Matter with Kansas? Why do all these people in Kansas vote against their economic interests for these Republicans who do nothing for them? And Frank argued that the culture wars were distractions from real politics, cynical tactics used by Republican politicians in order to con cultural conservatives into voting against their economic interest. Frank writes, "The trick never ages, the illusion never wears off. Vote to stop abortion, receive a rollback in the capital gains tax. Vote to make our country strong again, receive deindustrialization. Vote to strike a blow against elitism, receive a social order in which it is more concentrated than ever before in our lifetimes." The problem with this view, as I see it, is that human beings are cultural and religious as well as economic animals. Why assume that real politics is about economics, that religion, morality, and culture have nothing to do with it? So the first argument of the book is that culture wars cannot be seen in these three ways, but they need to be seen as cultural wars, wars about culture, fought on a variety of fronts, and should not be reduced to morality or religion or economics. They are accelerated by cultural anxieties about the loss of old forms of life and the inventions of new ones, and they pit monoculturalists against multiculturalists. Monoculturists with a centripetal understanding of the United States, where the forces are pressing into a unified vision of a unified past, and another with a more centrifugal view of culture that's thrilled by the spinning out of increasingly diverse cultural forms. The second argument of the book is that culture wars are conservative projects initiated and waged disproportionately on the right. The culture wars are battles between conservatives and liberals, but only superficially so. At a deeper level, they are conservative morality plays in which liberals are merely the props. Modern political conservatism, as I see it, is rooted in a narrative of loss and restoration. A form of culture is passing away, and it is worth fighting to revive it. In this regard, modern conservatism, which I and others trace back to Burke and the French Revolution, has obvious affinities with modern evangelicalism, which also offers meaning amidst uncertainty through narratives of loss and restoration, of lost souls at revivals, and of a Christian America stolen away by secularists. It also has affinities with the Bible, as Adam and Eve look over their shoulders on their exodus from Eden, as they mourn their loss and plot its reversal, they become the first conservatives. Still, there is much debate about whether the contemporary culture wars started on the left or the right. Conservatives repeatedly say the left started it by banning prayer from the public schools, or pushing for civil rights or women's rights, or by pushing for Roe v. Wade. But this is not historically accurate. Conservatives typically fire the first shots in the culture wars. Anti-Catholicism and anti-Mormonism were not backlash movements against revolutions from the left. They were reactions to the immigration of Catholics and the invention of Mormonism. Similarly, the culture wars of the 20s and 30s were responses to the rise of the saloon, to mixed drinks, and to interracial dancing. But the culture wars were not just instigated by the right. They are also waged disproportionately by the right. The metaphor of war, culture war, conjures up two sides in the American Revolution, for example, advancing on each other in relatively equal numbers of blue and red coats. But most of the shots in the Concords and Lexingtons of our culture wars were fired by those who had the most to lose, as the nation opened its borders to Irish Catholics and its arms to lesbians and gay men. To be sure, the left responded in each case and provoked skirmishes of its own. But if you're looking for an infatuation with violence, both real and imagined, that characterizes the culture wars, you are going to find it more often and more floridly on the right. My next argument is that culture wars have been won by the pluralists on the left, hence my title, Why Liberals Win. If culture wars are conservative morality plays produced and directed by conservatives, then we should expect right-wingers to play the big roles and wannabe culture warriors on the left to be assigned the bit parts. We should also expect conservatives to get the best lines, and we should not be surprised that conservatives cast themselves as the victims. What is surprising is that these dramas always seem to take on a life of their own, overtaking the intentions of their writers and directors. Gays and lesbians get marriage. A papist and an infidel, John F. Kennedy and Thomas Jefferson, get the White House. In every case, those who declared war on Jefferson or Catholics or Mormons or the sins of the 20s or the abominations of the 60s went down to defeat. There's an obvious paradox here. Culture wars are conservative projects, conservative morality plays produced and directed by conservatives on conservative stages and starring conservative actors. But liberals win. How can this be? Liberals may win for philosophical reasons, because the American principle of liberty is on their side. They may win for practical reasons, because the nation is becoming more Catholic or more brown as time goes on. But the most important reason they win is because their opponents attach themselves to lost causes. In culture wars from 1800 to the 21st century, conservatives pick fights they are already losing. This is their strategy. And once the fight is over, the liberals win. This strategy makes no sense if the goal is to win. But that is not the goal of culture warriors. Their goal is to preach a gospel of the fallen and the lost, to demonstrate just how far America has descended from the glory of its founding, and just how urgently the nation needs their projects of revival, recovery, and restoration. In this history of America's culture wars, I see a culture wars cycle that propels the nation from one cultural conflict to the next. This cycle begins on the right, with conservatives anxious about some cultural change they are experiencing as a loss. And the anxiety is different in each case. During the election of 1800, which was held amidst the aftershocks of the French Revolution, Federalists are anxious about their country falling into chaos. During the anti-Catholicism culture war, Protestants are anxious about the ways that immigrants are remaking their society into something they do not recognize. The anxiety catalyzing the anti-Mormon culture war concerns the breakdown of family values. The drama of prohibition and repeal is about alcohol, of course, but it is activated by an anxiety about the blooming, buzzing confusion of modern life. In the contemporary culture wars, conservatives give voice to their anxieties about the browning of the American population, and with it, the demise of white Christian America. In the face of each of these anxieties, conservatives launch an attack, blaming their political opponents for the loss they are experiencing and for threatening the health and welfare of the nation in the process. The result is an attack on them in the name of us. In the second movement of the culture wars cycle, the counterattack, the left strikes back to this original attack from conservatives. Progressives launch a counterattack, responding either by defending the change as a positive good, or more often, by appealing to the American principle of liberty, to insist that U.S. citizens have every right to run for office without being Protestants, or to drink a beer after work, or to secure an abortion. Next, step 3, comes some sort of accommodation. Culture wars are characterized by a rhetoric of no compromise, by appeals to moral absolutes and unchanging divine commandments, but they are always resolved via some sort of accommodation. Yes, Catholicism comes to be accepted as an American religion, but only after Catholics accept the separation of church and state. And Mormons become quintessential Americans, in the words of conservative columnist George Will, only after they give up on polygamy. In the fourth stage of the culture war cycle, the liberals win. In the conservative culture wars, conservatives did win a few victories. The ERA, they shot down the Equal Rights Amendment in 1982. They slashed the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts in 1994. They expanded the role of religion in public life, turning explicit God talk into the new normal inside both major political parties. Conservatives also succeeded in turning liberalism into a dirty word, recasting liberalism for large numbers of Americans as a moral threat. But conservatives lost the contemporary culture wars, and they lost them badly. They lost on tax exemptions for segregation academies. They lost on Clinton's impeachment. They lost on school prayer, on killing the National Endowment for the Arts, on casual sex, on the counterculture, which became the culture, on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, on abortion, still legal in every state, on marijuana, on the traditional family, and most strikingly and quickly on same-sex marriage. In almost every arena where the contemporary culture wars have been fought, education, law, media, entertainment, family, and the arts, liberals now control the agenda. Movies and television shows today make the sort of entertainment decried by the moral majority look like Leave It to Beaver. The old people can tell you what that means. Modern Family has won 5 straight Emmys. HBO's show Girls is clothing optional. In secondary and higher education, virtually all of the trends decried by 1980s conservatives remain firmly in place. Or, as sociologist Nathan Glazer says, we are all multiculturalists now. But liberals did not just win the contemporary culture wars. All the culture wars explored in my book went their way. The Federalists lost and went out of business. And the anti-Catholics lost, the anti-Mormons lost, and Prohibition was repealed. There will always be culture warriors who want to retire after losing a big fight. And some evangelicals today are talking of withdrawing into what blogger Rod Dreher refers to as the Benedict option of being off, aside, and not engaged from culture. But for most conservatives, any given loss energizes them for the next conflict. not least because it confirms their victimhood. Having lost one culture war, conservatives become even more convinced that other Americans are out to get them. They become more fearful that American society is going to hell. So they cast about for another grievance, something else that is precious and is passing away. All conservatism begins with loss, writes blogger Andrew Sullivan, and so it goes with America's culture wars, which, at least for conservatives, ends with loss as well. So those are my remarks. I am really happy to hear what you have to say, as long as you agree with everything I said, or to hear questions as long as they are easy. So please, let's hear, I'm just kidding, please let's hear from you. I'd love to have a conversation. Yes, hello.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you for coming.
Could you elaborate a little more on the issue of monoculturalism and pluriculturalism, and how this has been a war and maybe the trajectory of this war?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of more elaboration on that. And where do you think we are now? Within the evangelical camp, but also within the larger society.
Right.
I don't know if it makes sense.
No, it does. So, of course, the quick answer is I don't know the genealogy of the terms. So, the multicultural term became I would hazard the 1980s, became a critique of the left, right, from the right. So it was a kind of a sneer word. It wasn't a non-evaluative term. It became a way of criticizing people who just didn't have a culture like you're supposed to have, right? From the conservative position, you value tradition and culture, right? And you seek to preserve it, and you understand those cultures are local. And so you don't want to have imposition from the federal government onto it, and you don't want to have global forces that are destroying local culture, right? So, but typically that culture is seen, the way it does its work is if it is not contested, right? And so that's the monocultural idea. This was me struggling with taking my own advice and trying to see the culture wars as cultural, right, rather than as exclusively religious or exclusively economic or exclusively political or something else. And particularly as I was doing the research on Prohibition, I was just struck how much of that debate was about this emergent, this is the period, the 20s, we associate with emergence of modernism, right? Sort of cultural modernism that's coming over from the late 19th century and flowering in the 20s. And The Great Gatsby is about this era. And even in The Great Gatsby, there's a conversation there with different characters where one character is thrilled over the multiculturalism that is emerging, another character wants to puke over it, and another character is like, what are we supposed to do with this? Right? What are we supposed to do with this thing? So that divide between the monoculture and the multiculture is my effort to try to come up with a really simple description of the way that the cultural battle lines are drawn. Now, one place where this comes up, where it's really easy to see, is when Jimmy Carter is president. He has scheduled this White House conference on the family. And all these different groups are invited, including people on the right, on the religious right. Because Jimmy Carter is elected in 1976 really in part by sort of proto-religious right people, right? Wouldn't it be great to have an evangelical president, right? Who was going to, fight for Jesus, there. Well, it turned out that his fight for Jesus was very different fight for Jesus than, say, Jerry Falwell was imagining in his understanding of the right. But so in that conference, Carter, in Carter's people, in conversation with folks on the left, they changed the name of the conference to the White House Conference on Families. The White House Conference on the Family to the White House Conference on Families. And I thought, well, that is sort of epitomizes this debate over the family, right? Is the family just this collection of people, and it might have two daddies, it might have two mommies, it might have one mommy, it might have one daddy, it might have a grandmother, and you know what I mean? all those are families as long as there's love, right? That's one idea. And then the other idea is, no, there is, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and that's ordained by God, and even setting God aside, that's how societies have always organized themselves, around one man and one woman being married, right? So there you have, again, the one and the many kind of debate, right? So that's the way I see that. I see that playing out. And of course, sometimes on the left you have monoculturalists, right, who really do have one vision, that they don't want to be pluralists about a particular issue, right? And sometimes on the right you have some multiculturalism there as well, but I think that was my way of trying to make sense of that particular debate. Yes, hello, sir.
Again, thank you for coming. Just a fascinating presentation. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of an archetypal kind of role being reenacted on the right, kind of played over and over. I'm wondering if you're letting the other side, the left, off the hook a bit, because is there not the possibility of some archetypal stuff going on the other side, in a less organized way, perhaps?
Help me out. What would it be?
Kind of freedom, enlightenment, as you indicated, no moral constraints. This is about human beings alone. I mean, it seems like there might be certain issues on the left that keep coming up.
Right. So there definitely are, and there's definitely, historians have. U.S. historians write a lot about the culture wars. They write about them as a contemporary phenomenon. They don't write about them. Sometimes they'll go back to the 20s. But usually the idea is the 60s create a national debate about 60s culture. And then we split into the people who like the 60s and the people who hate the 60s, and that's the culture war, right? That's sort of the typical reading, right? And what's kind of interesting about the historiography is that it doesn't really matter if you're conservative or liberal so much about which way you go. So sometimes the liberals want the liberals to start the culture wars in the 70s or in the 60s because they see that as the revolution that they started that provided all these good things, right? And so they want to claim that they started the culture wars. Now the conservatives typically also want to say the same, right? They want to say that, hey, we didn't start this. I mean, Pat Buchanan says this, for example. We didn't start this. Like, we didn't go on the college campuses and start all this crazy radicalism of students rising up and, feminism at the colleges and, black studies instead of American studies. Like, we didn't do that. That was started by radicals who were trying to take over America, right? We are just trying to take it back. So there's this whole debate about that, and I admit that I'm on maybe a little bit of a shaky ground in making the argument for conservatives starting the culture wars, the contemporary culture wars. My argument, which I didn't really make explicit in this piece, is that the culture wars are about the 60s, but they didn't start in the 60s. So there's the 60s, and they happen. All that 60s stuff happened, right? And then there's the reflection upon the 60s, and that happens in the 70s. It happens kind of in the mid-70s to early 80s. It's that reflection that starts the culture wars, not the 60s themselves, is my argument. And also, I see the anger and the warrior nature of it as being more present on the right there. Now, the earlier culture wars, it's much easier to make the argument. It's very hard to make the argument that the left is starting these, because typically what happens is you essentially have social demographic shifts that are just kind of happening that no one's really, Catholics are just coming here. It's not like there's a big group of like pro-Catholic, we need to bring the Catholics, you stupid Protestant people. It's just Catholics come, right? And then once they get to a point where there's enough of them that they start to seem dangerous, then the Protestants start to object. Similar thing happens with the saloon. It's not really like there's a left-wing conspiracy to undermine family values by the saloon. The saloon just emerges for all sorts of reasons, including capitalism itself, right? That there's opportunities to make money, and people can, and there's no laws against it, so they do. So those cases seem much easier. Now, when the left engages, undoubtedly they engage with their rhetoric, and the core rhetoric is the liberty rhetoric. That's the core rhetoric. So it's really interesting in the polygamy debate, the left never says, I shouldn't say never, but I found like 2 examples of people who were pro-Mormon, non-Mormons who were pro-Mormon, who tried to make arguments for Mormonism and for polygamy, but the arguments really were almost always, the arguments are, this is a disgusting thing, it's a barbaric thing, but they have every right to do it under the Constitution. And by the way, another argument was, and this is another fascinating piece of that story in my view, is the people, the Republicans in the East who would be most against polygamy, the Democrats in the East, in the South, who would be totally against polygamy for religious reasons, couldn't oppose polygamy because they didn't want to be in favor of federal intervention in a local matter of the family, because that would open the door to federal intervention of the local matter of the family of slavery. And so, they felt so, the speeches in the Congressional Record, which I do a lot of work with in the book, so often they just go on and on about the disgusting of polygamy, but we can't do anything about it because there's the liberty to do that. So there's no doubt that they appeal to that rhetoric. I think the story of it, though, the narrative push is a conservative narrative. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, let me push back a little bit on your choice of culture war cases. So I guess the first question would be, did you settle on the ones, particularly the first 3, because those struck you as the most important or the only ones or the ones that fit the model you were seeing with the 20th century ones? So would you say that there are other cases of culture wars, or these are the only ones? And if there are other ones, why not include them? Is it the length of the book, or is it because they don't quite fit the same definition? So for example, I think of, I just had a class this morning on Indian removal. So you could read the conflict over Indians in the 19th century as a culture war kind of story if you want to. You can read labor management disputes as entailing culture wars. You could read other immigrant episodes through the 20th century into the 21st century as culture wars. Some have more religion in them, some have less, but almost all of them have religion somewhere, and it's more of a minor chord or a major chord. So are you sure that all of those other cases either shouldn't be considered culture wars, or if we did include them in your analysis, that they would point to the same conclusion? Right.
Okay. Thank you. That's a great question. I'll answer that 2 ways. One is just how I did it, and then the other is how I should have done it. So how I did it was I was troubled by the Ground Zero Mosque case, and I was annoyed by the way we talk about culture wars as if, I mean, this is a typical historian's thing, right? Oh, this isn't new, this is old, right? That's what historians do. So, so I had those 2 things going. So it was clear for me to go to anti-Mormonism and to anti-Catholicism, right? Because those are clear analogs, right? You have a debate about whether Muslims can be Americans, right? So we had prior debate. Could Mormons be Americans? Could Catholics be Americans? Is there something fundamentally anti-American about this religion? And we see this with Ben Carson's recent comments about Islam, right? Would you want a Muslim to be president? No. And then when he clarifies why, because Islam is contrary to American values, right? So that same debate we had, very close debate to those. So that's how I got to those. Then I got to the election of 1800 through the elections of 2008, through the election of 2008, when there was so much conversation about this election is ugly. This is really mean-spirited. This has got to be the worst in American history. And of course, U.S. historians always say, no, 1800 was worse, right? And I believe it was worse than 2008. So that's what got me there. And then what got me to Prohibition was I needed something between, right? And that was the between one. So that's how I got there. Now, I do say in the book that these are episodes I've chosen, and there's other episodes. The ones I was more troubled about not including, I don't really think Indian removal was a culture war, because part of what the culture war requires is two vigorous sides in a debate. There was debate about the Indian removal. There was. But let me back off on that. Maybe I don't want to sustain that position. But my guess is that there wasn't enough on the pro-Indian side for it to be really vigorous the way these others were vigorous debates. The ones that more troubled me were the ones that were explicitly about race. So the Civil War was a culture war, right? It was a culture war that produced physical war. And the Civil Rights Movement was also a culture war. But what I do in the introduction to try to excuse myself for not doing those, and the reason I didn't want to do them was because I did want to publish the book. It was going to take me too long if I kept. And also, those episodes in American history are so well written. Those are so well known. I just thought it would take me years to write a chapter on the slavery debates. And I thought it would take me years to write a chapter on the Civil Rights Movement. So I made a distinction in my, and there's a big debate among historians and anthropologists about is race cultural, and is culture racial? And I just weighed in and I said, I just see culture as different from race. And that the book is about cultural debates, and that the race debates are in some way more important than this book, but they're distinguishable, and I made arguments for how they were distinguishable. So the answer is really I just picked these episodes. Now, I did not, in my defense, I did not pick episodes that would fit my thesis, because I didn't have my thesis until long after I picked my episodes. And I started doing them, and I started saying, this is really weird, because as a New Englander surrounded by liberals, I always have the sense that the liberals are losing the culture wars. That's the rhetoric we hear in Boston, right? These conservatives, these crazy religious right people, the Bible thumpers, they're like winning. They're changing America. Like, what's going on? This used to be our country, that kind of stuff. So I didn't have my argument at all that liberals were winning, and then as I was doing it, I became surprised by that. So I didn't pick them because of that. That could be another criticism, that if you picked 5 more, you'd find ones where the other side is winning.
I have a question about.
Hi.
Hi. On the right, the idea or framing of loss and restoration is intriguing, and then on the left, if I heard you correct, liberty as a reason or motivation or framing.
Liberty and progress, right?
Okay, yeah, thank you. And progress. Do you see loss and restoration on the left as well, or do you really want? These are ideal, typical categories.
Right.
Obviously.
Right.
The
Well,
reason I'm asking is because a sense of nostalgia.
Yeah.
That could be partly real, but also the role of imagination. The imagination of the past, imagination of the future.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you can find some nostalgia on the left, and some sense of loss and hope for restoration, right? Like this used to be a country where it used to be a secular country, and now it's run by Christians, right? And we should go back to it being a secular country. So you find that. So it's the same. That's the same structure, same narrative structure. But I think the more typical narrative structure on the left is the world is changing, and change is good, and it's progressing. It's a more like evolutionary kind of concept, right? So things are moving, changing, moving forward. The change is good, and the people who are obstructing change are these kind of obstructionists who don't understand that the world, is changing and moving forward. So I think that's typically the narrative posture, more the narrative posture on the left. And the narrative posture on the right, as I said, is this lost cause kind of idea that, on my reading, antedates the Civil War. And there's important writing about the Civil War as lost cause. The Reconstructionist period. Charles Reagan Wilson has a great book and a great important essay about the religion of the lost cause and how there emerges in the wake of the Civil War in the former Confederate States in the South this rhetoric that is tied to atonement theories about the death of Jesus on the cross, that the South sort of paradoxically won the Civil War by being crucified in the Civil War, right? So there's this literature that I'm drawing on there for this lost cause idea, but my argument is that actually antedates that's the use of that is picking up on this trope that's been going on already in American cultural politics. Yes, hi.
I'm wondering how American you see these patterns as being. You can think of a lot of culture wars that are playing out in the news these days in places like France and Hungary that echo some of the themes that you've been talking about: multiculturalism, monoculturalism, narratives of cultural declension. Is there something distinctive about how these things happen in America, or is it all is it generalizable to Western democracies, or how do you see that?
I have no idea. No, I don't. I mean, you'd have to do a comparative project that I haven't done. I follow India a fair amount, and the situation in India is really fascinating now because it seems so similar to the American culture wars I've just finished writing about, where you have the election of a explicitly religious political party, the BJP, Hindu nationalists, and you have this idea that Prime Minister Modi, as he's emerging, is going to press the economic development part of the party, and then surprisingly, including surprising me, and people much more knowledgeable about India than myself, he seems to be playing the cultural card. He did this in the election in Bihar that he just lost. And he played that cultural card very hard, that India is for Hindus. And very similar to the culture wars that we've had about Christian nation, about Mormonism, Catholicism, etc. And I have a very good friend who's involved in that culture war on the left. And I was asking her when things were emerging a couple years ago, where's the religious left? Isn't there anybody who comes along and says, you're besmirching my Hinduism when you have this right-wing reading of my Hinduism? And she said to me, no. She said, the only two positions is secular left position and religious right position, that there's no civil space between those two positions. And I wanted to say to her, you should be in that space, like you're a Hindu, But as a public figure, she can't be a Hindu. She has to be a secularist. There's no middle space there. So anyway, I think you'd have to do a comparative culture war project and see to what extent this model fits other places. I just don't know. It's a really good question. Do students have any questions, or is it all just the old fogies here, like myself, who have questions? Yes, hi.
Hi. I was kind of curious about how the culture wars affect our approach to science and the universe.
Yeah, thank you for that question. One of the things that really intrigues me about the contemporary situation is how we have been trained. This is how politics has been done my whole adult lifetime. I mean, I was born in 1960, so when this stuff really got going in the late 70s, that's when I became, 18 years old. So my whole lifetime we've done this, and one thing that's happened in the last 5 or 10 years is that this way of doing cultural politics has bled over into politics in general. And I talked about that a little at the beginning. But we now have a kind of culture war mentality about a lot of other things. There's a website that you can go to find out the politics of all these companies. so you can figure out which coffee place to buy from that's more Republican or more Democrat, right? These things that we would kind of assume are not political, right? Like business, right? And it's interesting because the business community in America has always wanted to be not political, right? Because it's not good for business, right? If you're Starbucks and you're the Democratic coffee shop, that's not good. You want to sell coffee to everyone, right? So it's really curious that this has gone this way. And you know, there's a lot of conversation about, you know, what's happened to truth in the wake of this, where everything is polemical, you know. I mean, it used to be, and part of this has to do with the populism, incipient populism in the culture wars, that we used to defer to experts. So, I mean, John Kennedy was famous for this, right? He brings in all these best and the brightest people. He doesn't care what party they're from. He just asks them, like, what's the problem with housing? What's the problem with race relations? What's the problem? And these academics from Harvard would write these studies, and Kennedy would, like, put them into law, right? And people wouldn't say, oh, that's the left-wing, ridiculous theory. They would think, oh, that's what smart people tell us about housing. That's what we are supposed to do about housing. Or about science, right? There would be no thought of the race to the moon having to toggle back and forth between conservatives and liberals depending on who became president, right? I mean, it was just, that should be handled by the race to the moon people, by good, astrophysicists, right? So, what I talk about as the culture war of everything is hurting us in the science space, because now we increasingly imagine that everything is kind of politically polarized. And so there has to be, if Obama has this position on that scientific thing, then if you're a Republican, you have to take the other position. Or if Donald Trump has that position and you're a Democrat, then you have to take that position. So I think the effect has been very bad. Yeah, I think the effect has been very bad. And it's hard to have a public culture move forward when you can't agree on certain facts about things, right? Like, let's have a study to figure out. What was last night, Rubio said, welders make more than philosophers, right? Well, this is false. It's an empirical question, right? You can go look up how much philosophy majors make and how much welding students make, or how much people who call themselves philosophers, right? So, and of course, thanks to Twitter, like within 10 minutes, I could see those studies last night, 10 minutes after Rubio said that. But, and there's examples of that on the left too, but it doesn't trouble us in the way before, where there would be a kind of public shame about that, like, oh yeah, I just said that in the heat of the moment, I know I'm wrong about that, apologies to the philosophers, and the same in the science space, Yes, hi.
Hello. Do you have any thoughts about what the antidote to culture wars ought to be? Are there voices from within these camps that ought to rise up and try to diffuse the intensity of the entrenched positions? Anything that you learned from history that diffuses these polarized contexts?
So thank you for that. I'm really I'm conflicted. I mean, on the one side, historians aren't supposed to go there, right? But I'm happy to go there, so I sort of violate the rules of my guild. I'm happy to go there, but I'm actually conflicted because I feel this the culture wars cycle, as I see it, feels really entrenched, and it's also really powerful. Like, it actually strategically, politically works. It works. You can get elected with this. So it's hard, at least now, you can get elected with it. So it's hard to imagine in the short term how it goes away. That said, I addressed this in a prior book project I did called The American Bible, which was a study of maybe 25 or 30 of the core texts in American public life. If you were going to put together a Bible, a collection of sacred texts, what would they be? And I wasn't as interested in the texts themselves, but more interested in the interpretation of the texts after they were written. So I wasn't so much interested in the I have a dream speech as I was in how people used I have a dream language over time to make arguments in the public space. That's what the book is about. And so in that project, I noticed what I call, and I briefly mentioned this in my talk, the great tradition of conciliation. And so as these culture wars emerge, you always have these figures, like Jefferson was the figure in my talk today, in his first inaugural, who, once he becomes president, he shifts his rhetoric, his culture war rhetoric, and he starts to do God talk, right? And he starts to go to church when he's president. And he has that great line about we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, right? And there's other examples of this. There's Patrick Henry, who says, I am not a Virginian, I'm an American. You know, in other words, I'm not pursuing the interests of my colony, I'm pursuing the interests of the country, right? Or John F. Kennedy, who says that civility is not a sign of weakness. Or Barack Obama in his Democratic Party speech that made him famous, where he said, I'm not a member of the red states, I'm not a member of the blue states, I'm a member of the United States. These sorts of conciliatory, we are Americans together kind of language we have. And we go back to them in times of crisis. We went back to them right after 9/11, right? What did Bush do with the Islam question after 9/11? Bush was, I'm a religious liberty person. Bush was great on Islam after 9/11. He was great. If we had a Republican now running on the Bush language about Islam, they would be on the far right of the second of the debates, you know, like way over, I should say on the far left, like way over in the corner where no one would notice them, where they're less than 1% vote. So we do have this tradition, and it's in a lot of our great documents. And so we have a memory of it, but and I do think that's part of the job of historians, is to remind us of that memory, of that tradition that we have. Hi. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that race is distinguishable from culture. Could you clarify your position on how race plays into the culture wars?
Yeah, so race plays a huge part in the contemporary culture wars. I'm of the view that it's impossible to understand the hostility to Barack Obama without race analysis. Like and I've gone back and forth on this during his presidency because I really didn't want to see it that way, but I can't not see it that way. I can't. It doesn't make sense to me. Without the peace, without the sense of white men like myself feeling, you know, somebody's taking we used to be in charge of this place, and now other people are in charge. I think that the symbol of a black man doing that is palpable, and I think that that's not a non-issue in the culture wars. I think that is an issue in the culture wars. I also believe that the culture wars were activated, and this isn't my belief, a number of people have written about this, well, were not activated by the family questions. They weren't activated by the abortion question. The abortion question is not an important issue on the religious right until really 1980, 1981. The Republican Party is pro-life pro-choice until, I believe, 1980. And the Republican Party is in favor of the ERA, you know, until very late. That I really think it was the Segregation Academy issue that really gets the culture wars, the contemporary culture wars going, and that's about desegregation. That's about Brown v. Board of Education. What happens there is a lot of southern towns, they close their public schools, and then they open a private school, and then the private school is only open to white people, and there's no public school in the town at all. And so it kind of becomes this shuffling where basically the same school is still in the town. It's just a different school. And the defense of that from the religious right was that those were Christian schools, and they were being attacked by the IRS, not around the race issue, but because the IRS was a secular humanist organization that was trying to undermine the Christianity of that school. This was Richard Nixon, by the way, the Richard Nixon IRS. So that's a little hard to imagine that Nixon would be interested in that. But so I think that's going on. If you look at the anti-Mormon debates, there's really interesting rhetoric about Mormons as non-white, as comparing Mormons to Orientals, comparing Mormons to like barbarian hordes and images of Mormons. I mean, Mormons, you could be a Mormon, right? I mean, I don't know you, but like you look pretty Mormon to me, right? So I mean, Mormons are in America, like they're like these white people right now. Of course, Mormonism actually has amazing missions all over the world to non-white people, and the Mormon movement is growing huge in Africa and other places. But Mormons, if you can draw a picture of Mormons in the 19th century, they do not look Oriental, you know, and they don't look dark and Southern and black. But a lot of these images of Mormons did make them look like dangerous, non-white racial people. So race was part of those culture wars as well. Yes, hi.
Hi. Particularly given the history of the segregation academies and their influence on contemporary culture wars, how do you see the culture wars of the 1970s as influencing the public education system or as being portrayed in the contemporary public education system?
Yeah, so I think one thing that happens is that the right starts to see public schools as irredeemably lost, right? It starts to see them as agents of a federal government that's committed to secular humanism. And so they cease to be, when public schools began, I write about this a lot in my religious literacy book, which is a lot about the history of education in the United States, but when public schools began, they were thoroughly religious. I mean, all the public schools read the Bible, and they did not read it as literature. They read it as the truth, and they read the King James Bible, and they would have devotional Bible readings. I don't know how much religion there is here at Westmont. I would think there's a fair amount, but there was probably more in the public schools in the 1830s in the United States. There was a lot of religion there. And the purpose of the public schools was to raise moral citizens, and morality, the only way people imagined morality then would be based on religion, and the only real religion was Christianity, and the only real form of Christianity was Protestantism, and the source of Protestant authority was the Bible, and the only real Bible was the King James Bible. So you had to read the Bible. So they all read the Bible. And so the public school's initial purpose was to promote Christian civilization, like to promote evangelical Protestant civilization, because this is a period of the emergence of evangelicalism. And so that was the idea at the beginning. Now, over time, it becomes secularized, and there are Supreme Court decisions that the religious right gets really mad about that in the early 60s that take devotional Bible reading and prayer out of the public schools in 1962 and 1963. So they see that, the religious right sees that as imposition of a religious ideology, namely secular humanism. And so I think that as that percolates, there becomes less and less public confidence. The public schools become less places for common culture, common public life. And this is why the push for, say, vouchers for religious education, private education is really strong in the GOP now, because it's seen as, and the same with homeschooling, it's seen as a way out of that propaganda machine that is the public schools. So I think that's the main legacy, is the sort of sense that the public schools are lost and are kind of a propaganda factory for the left. Yeah, hi.
Hi. Very interesting argument. I wonder what you mean by the liberals winning the culture war. Are you talking in just through the courts in terms of policy, or are you talking about in the court of public opinion? I think when you're talking through the courts and public policy, you're right, but I'm not sure if you're right when it comes to the court of public opinion on a number of contemporary issues.
Well, like what?
Well, I think abortion's pretty, I think that's still fairly divisive. Prayer in public schools,
Yeah.
regardless of court decision.
Yeah, that's true. They do. Right. So I mean it both ways. I'm actually less interested in. I mean, I am interested in the law, but I'm at least equally interested in the court of public opinion. And I think that on most of these culture war issues, what you see is, like I say, the liberals winning. So to make an argument now that Catholics cannot be good Americans because they're tied to a pope who's going to tell them how to vote and who's going to undermine the Constitution, I mean, that's just wacky talk now. Not that some Americans don't engage in it, but it's just not, nobody's going to say that in public and be taken seriously. Anti-Mormonism is the same. I was fascinated by the way evangelicals capitulated on Mormonism in the Romney election. I was kind of disappointed. I was looking forward to evangelicals going after him for this crazy religion. But they didn't. I think we could talk about why they didn't, but if you line up, I mean, I gave a long list of the ones, the culture war, contemporary culture wars ones where the left is winning. The abortion case is really interesting because most Americans do favor Roe v. Wade. Most Americans do favor legal access to abortion. Most Americans have way more qualms about that than sort of official Democratic Party pro-life, position, right? I mean, I think if you had to find the dead middle of America on the abortion question, it would probably be abortion is okay in the case of incest and rape. Abortion is really morally troublesome as a sort of lifestyle choice, but probably ought to be legal. But isn't it a shame that we have so many of them? I mean, I think that's probably sort of the down the middle policy. But look at what happened to gay marriage. Totally shocks me. Totally shocks me. I mean, gay marriage is done. I mean, so quickly, like 10 or 15 years. That's a huge transformation. I mean, I teach a fair amount about religious rituals at Boston University in my religious studies classes. I mean, rituals are slow to change, I mean, my book about cremation, which I'm sure all of you have read my book on cremation, right? Huge bestseller. One thing that's fascinating about that is, death rites change really slow. I mean, death rites can take thousands of years to change in a civilization, right? Marriage, similarly slow to change. I mean, marriage rituals, but man, really fast. Marijuana legalization really surprises me. It's going to be hard to find a town in America where you can't just walk into some shop in 10 years and smoke a joint. I mean, those are going to be weird towns. Those are going to be like dry towns, that we have now in the United States. So, a lot of these issues have really moved very quickly in the court of public opinion. I mean, the abortion question too. I mean, I think it's harder to say the liberals are winning the abortion issue because it is fairly well divided. Also because the strategy on the right has been to kind of chip away at those with legal strategies that involve, parental consent and 3-day waiting periods and viewing images of, the fetus and things like that. So and recent strategies of essentially making abortion providers be set up almost like a hospital, so that some states now only have 2 or 3 abortion providers. So there's ways in which there's been rightward movement on that. But I would still say if you could come up with a list of 20 of the hot button issues of the last generation, that the left has won in the court of public opinion on like 17 of them or something.
How do you think that affects our efforts in evangelism?
Can you say more about that?
Well,
what do you mean by efforts in evangelism? To convert people to
are going out and trying to reach the lost for the Lord.
Well, I think the culture wars are one of the sources of the rise of religious disaffiliation in the United States. So I would say that they affect them negatively. I think that one reason, I was just talking on the radio today about this new Pew study that shows that the religiously disaffiliated rose over the last 8 years in the U.S. from 16% to 23%. So 23% of Americans now, if asked, what religion are you, will say they don't have any religion. They're atheists or agnostics, or they're non-participants in any religion. And I think one of the reasons for that is that increasingly Americans associate Christianity with conservative politics. So that when they hear the word Christian, and more broadly when they hear the word religion, they think of the Republican Party. And they think of opposition to homosexuality, and they think of opposition to abortion, and they think of hostility to black people, and they think of various things that people on the left associate with the Republican Party. And I think that there's been a really sort of fatal strategic move by evangelicals in getting into bed with the Republican Party. And so I think that that's really hurt, at least in the United States. If you're talking about foreign evangelism, probably not as much. But in terms of trying to evangelize in the U.S., I think that's really hurt the Christian brand. And so people just sort of are thinking, a little bit like during World War II, there was the co-optation of the Christian brand by fascists in England, and that's when the language of Judeo-Christianity emerged in the United States, right? That we're Judeo-Christians. We're Jewish-friendly and Catholic-friendly Protestants, right? Rather than anti-Semitic Protestants, or rather than anti-Catholic Protestants. So there hasn't been a similar rebranding that's been done. So I would say it hurts negatively. And I think that's one reason why I mentioned very briefly Rod Dreher and this Benedict option idea of evangelical Christian withdrawal from the public space. Why should we continue to be manipulated in the public space is the idea when we don't get what we want from the Republican Party. Like, we elect Ronald Reagan, we elect George W. Bush. He's one of us. Like, why don't we evangelicals get what's coming to us? And that we're basically being used. And so what we need to do is go back to this early Christian model of existing on the fringes of society, and where we're interested in sustaining the Christian movement in terms that are Christian rather than fallen, and are Christian rather than co-opted, so that we can do our thing rather than always running around trying to do the thing that's most politic. That would be my short answer to that difficult question. We should probably stop, right? We've run out of time. I will be here. I'm happy to have more questions, happy to have conversation with you. I thank you all for coming, especially the students, but all of you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much.